What if the very first word of the Lord's Prayer is not what Jesus actually said? What if for centuries, millions have repeated a translation that is correct enough to survive but too limited to transform? The first word spoken by Jesus in that sacred prayer was never meant to describe a distant authority watching from heaven. It was spoken in Aramaic as Abwoon, and hidden inside that one word is an entirely different relationship with the divine. Stay with me until the end, because once you understand why Jesus chose Abwoon instead of a simple word for Father, you may never pray the Lord's Prayer the same way again. When the disciples asked Jesus how they should pray, they were not asking for another religious formula. They had watched him withdraw into silence, return with extraordinary peace, and speak with an authority unlike anyone they had ever known. They wanted to understand the source of that inner communion, not simply memorize beautiful words. The answer begins with a single Aramaic word. Abwoon. This was the first word that opened what we now call the Lord's Prayer. Yet most people never hear it, because nearly every translation replaces it with Our Father. While understandable as a translation, something profound disappears the moment Abwoon is removed. In Aramaic, words rarely function as simple dictionary definitions. They carry movement, relationship, experience, and layers of meaning that cannot be compressed into one English equivalent. A Bwoon is one of those words. It points toward origin, lobbying source, divine nurturing, intimate closeness, and the life from which everything exists. It is not merely a family title. It is an invitation into conscious relationship. This explains why the prayer begins differently than many people imagine. Jesus was not teaching his disciples to approach God primarily through fear, distance, or obligation. He began with identity before request, before daily bread, before forgiveness, before guidance. He established where the human spirit belongs. This order changes everything. Many people spend their lives trying to earn acceptance from God. Yet Jesus begins by reminding his listeners of connection before performance. Relationship comes before petition. Belonging comes before asking. The prayer starts from union rather than separation. That may explain why the words of Jesus carried such unusual authority. His confidence did not appear to come from external power. It flowed from knowing the source from which he lived. A beautiful glimpse of this appears naturally in the Gospel of Matthew. Chapter 6, where Jesus introduces this prayer while teaching his disciples not to pray with empty repetition, but with sincerity and inner awareness. Imagine beginning every prayer not from fear of being unheard, but from remembering where your deepest life already comes from. That is, the doorway opened by Abwoon. Before a single request is spoken, the heart has already returned home. In just a little while, we're going to pause together for a short practice prayer using Abwoon exactly as a sacred form of address. Before we do, you first need to understand why this single word has the power to change the way you approach every challenge in life. Modern life creates an invisible feeling of separation. People feel disconnected from purpose, from peace, from themselves, and often from God. The more disconnected they become, the harder they try to force solutions through anxiety, endless thinking, and constant striving. The prayer taught by Jesus quietly reverses that entire pattern. Instead of beginning with problems, Jesus begins with remembrance. Instead of starting with lack, he begins with source. Instead of emphasizing distance, he emphasizes relationship. This is not simply poetic language. It is a spiritual reorientation that changes how the mind interprets every circumstance. When someone repeatedly approaches God only from desperation, the heart easily remains trapped in fear. But when someone approaches through Abwoon, the first movement becomes trust. The nervous system relaxes. The mind becomes quieter. Hope begins to replace survival. This episode is not about changing one English word for another. It is about recovering the spiritual architecture hidden inside the original language of Jesus. Every great structure depends on its foundation, and the Lord's Prayer begins with its foundation in the very first word. Over the centuries, translations faithfully carried the message across cultures, yet every translation also simplifies. That is inevitable. Our purpose is not to reject those translations, but to rediscover the depth that the original Aramaic still preserves for anyone willing to listen carefully. Soon, You'll experience Abwoon not merely as a concept, but as something spoken from your own heart. When that happens, you may discover that prayer feels less like asking a distant heaven for help and more like awakening to the divine presence that Jesus always knew was near. If you feel this is your moment of transformation, our Aramaic wisdom guide is waiting for you in the first pinned comment to guide you on your journey. And the best is yet to come. In the next chapters, you'll discover what could change everything for you. Abwoon, today I return to you not as someone abandoned, but as someone who remembers where life truly begins. Quiet every anxious thought within me, and replace fear with trust. Let your wisdom become the foundation beneath every decision I make. Restore my heart to the peace that Jesus revealed. May I live from your presence instead of my worries, and may every step I take today reflect the confidence of one who already belongs to you. Amen. The greatest misunderstanding about the Lord's Prayer is not found in its requests. It is found in its beginning. Every request that follows receives its meaning from the very first word. If that word is misunderstood, then the entire prayer is heard through the wrong lens. This is why recovering Abwoon is not an academic exercise. It is the restoration of the spiritual foundation upon which Jesus built the entire prayer. Most people have been taught to imagine God as distant, seated somewhere beyond the clouds, waiting to decide whether he will answer. Yet when Jesus spoke Abwoon, he invited his listeners into something much deeper. He was pointing toward the divine source from which life continually flows. The relationship begins with intimacy before authority, with belonging before obedience, with love before fear. This understanding also explains why Jesus displayed such remarkable peace in situations that terrified everyone around him. Storms, opposition, rejection, even death itself never appeared to disconnect him from his inner certainty. His strength did not depend upon changing external circumstances. It came from remaining consciously united with the source he addressed as Abwoon. Imagine what that perspective does to anxiety. Fear constantly whispers that you are alone. It tells you that everything depends on your own strength, your own intelligence, your own control. But Abwoon quietly dissolves that illusion. Every time the word is remembered, it reminds the heart that life is sustained by a presence infinitely greater than personal effort. This is why the prayer begins before any request is made. Jesus understood that a fearful heart cannot truly receive wisdom. A divided mind cannot recognize the quiet guidance already being offered. Before speaking about provision, forgiveness, purpose, or protection, he restored the disciples' awareness of relationship. Many ancient Aramaic scholars have observed that words in Semitic languages often communicate experience rather than mere information. They invite participation rather than observation. Abwoon is one of those living words. It is meant to be entered, experienced, and embodied until it reshapes the way a person sees every challenge. When this happens, prayer slowly changes its character. It becomes less about convincing God to come closer and more about awakening to the nearness that was always there. That subtle shift may be the greatest hidden treasure inside the first word ever spoken in the Lord's Prayer. Once the meaning of Abwoon begins to settle into the heart, something remarkable happens. The Lord's Prayer no longer sounds like a sequence of religious requests. Instead, it unfolds as a progressive awakening. Every sentence naturally grows from the first word, just as branches grow from the same living tree. Consider what follows immediately after Abwoon. Jesus does not rush into asking for material needs. He first directs attention toward the holiness of the divine name, the manifestation of the kingdom, and the alignment of heaven and earth. This order reveals a profound spiritual principle. Inner alignment always comes before outward transformation. Modern culture teaches the opposite. We are encouraged to believe that peace will arrive after circumstances improve. We tell ourselves that we will finally rest when money increases, relationships heal, or uncertainty disappears. But Jesus reversed that entire sequence. Peace begins within. Clarity begins within. Transformation begins within. The first word establishes the identity of the one who prays. The next words establish the reality in which that person now chooses to live. The prayer becomes a movement away from fear and toward conscious participation in divine life. This perspective also explains why the teachings of Jesus have continued to transform hearts across centuries and cultures. They are not merely moral instructions. They are invitations to perceive reality differently. A person who truly lives from Abwoon stops reacting to life as an orphan, searching for security, and begins responding as someone who already lives from an inexhaustible source. Perhaps that is why the first disciples sensed that there was something entirely different about the way Jesus prayed. They were not impressed simply by his words. They were witnessing a life completely anchored in trust. His authority flowed naturally because his identity was never separated from the one he called Abwoon. Today, that same invitation remains open. Every time you begin the Lord's Prayer, you have the opportunity to remember that the journey starts with relationship, not religion. It starts with communion, not performance. It starts with remembering who God truly is, before remembering what you need. When that first word is restored to its original depth, the rest of the prayer opens like a door that had been hidden in plain sight all along. For those who wish to go beyond this video, I have prepared Volume 2 with 33 more Aramaic words, a practical guide to the original teachings and hidden codes of Jesus. The link is pinned in the comments. Everything we have explored so far leads to one practical question. How do you move Abwoon from an interesting ancient word into a living daily experience? Jesus never intended spiritual truth to remain intellectual. His teachings were always meant to become a way of living. A seed only fulfills its purpose when it takes root, and Abwoon becomes transformative only when it begins to shape the rhythm of your everyday life. For the next 7 days, begin each morning with a moment of stillness before looking at your phone, reading the news, or thinking about your responsibilities. Take a slow breath, relax your shoulders, and gently speak Abwoon 3 times. Do not rush the word. Allow it to settle into your awareness. Instead of asking immediately for solutions, spend a few moments remembering that your life begins in the divine source that Jesus revealed. As you repeat Abwoon, let one simple thought accompany the word. I begin this day connected to the source of wisdom, peace, and life. You are not trying to force an emotional experience. You are training your mind to return to the same inner orientation that shaped the life of Jesus. Over time, this practice becomes less of a ritual and more of a new way of seeing. Throughout the day, whenever anxiety appears, resist the impulse to react immediately. Pause for a single deep breath and quietly say, Abwoon once. Allow that sacred word to interrupt the cycle of fear before it grows stronger. You may be surprised how often clarity arrives after only a few seconds of stillness. At night, before sleeping, reflect on the moments when you remembered the presence behind Abwoon, and the moments when fear pulled your attention elsewhere. Do this without guilt or self-judgment. Simply notice the difference. Day after day, this gentle awareness strengthens your inner peace far more effectively than constant striving. The goal is not repetition for its own sake. The goal is remembrance. Every repetition of Abwoon becomes a quiet return to the relationship that Jesus placed at the very beginning of the Lord's Prayer. Little by little, the word stops being something you pronounce and becomes the place from which you live. The first word of the Lord's Prayer has echoed across the centuries, yet for most people, its deepest meaning has remained hidden behind translation. Today, we have not discarded the familiar words. Instead, we have stepped behind them to glimpse the original doorway through which Jesus invited his disciples to enter. When Jesus said Abwoon, he was doing far more than introducing a prayer. He was revealing a relationship. Before speaking about provision, forgiveness, protection, or purpose, he established the identity of the one who prays. That order was never accidental. It reminds us that lasting transformation always begins from connection with the divine source rather than from fear of human circumstances. Perhaps this is why so many people repeat the Lord's Prayer faithfully and yet never experience the profound peace that shines through the life of Jesus. The words are spoken, but the first invitation is often overlooked. Once Abwoon is restored to its original depth, every sentence that follows acquires a new beauty and a new power. Imagine how differently your days might unfold if every challenge began with remembrance instead of worry. Imagine facing uncertainty from the confidence that you are already connected to the source of wisdom, rather than trying to create security through endless effort. That is not merely an inspiring idea. It is the spiritual path that Jesus quietly placed inside the very first word of his prayer. The ancient Aramaic language continues to preserve treasures that can renew the way we read the gospel today. Every recovered word invites us to move beyond habit and into deeper understanding. As we continue uncovering these forgotten meanings, we discover that the teachings of Jesus are not becoming less relevant. With time, they are becoming more alive. We are just scratching the surface of this ancient power. Get ready, because in our next video, I will reveal even deeper Aramaic codes that unlock spiritual authority you've never imagined. Make sure you are subscribed and have notifications turned on so you don't miss this unfolding revelation. Join the hundreds of students already practicing the original Aramaic through our study guides. The link is in the first pinned comment. Before you leave, if this message touched your heart or brought new understanding into your life, WRITE the word restoration in the comments below. Your testimony may encourage someone else who is seeking healing and renewal. Thank you for sharing this moment of ancient wisdom with us. Until the next revelation, walk in peace, walk in freedom, and walk in the power of Abwoon. Be open.